Great. So, Kiran, thank you again for joining us. Would love to, I think what's really unique about your place in the STIR ecosystem, so to speak, is that you have had the opportunity to be on kind of both sides, right, with your work with Oakland and being back at Neighborly. So I would love for you to just kind of give an intro about who you are, what brought you to the work that you're doing now, and maybe a little bit about what you find interesting about the STIR program, and then we'll get into some more granular questions. How does that sound?
I'm the COO of Neighborly, a public finance technology company. Prior to that, I was in the city attorney's office in Oakland, driving a great deal of civic innovation and land use, real estate development work. I took a sabbatical from Neighborly to serve as the mayor's chief resilience officer, where I was able to take a systems-based approach to thinking about city governance, as well as the policies and programs that we put in place to serve our community. So that work was really threefold. It was around building more resilient institutions and around government, and that was with the launch of the Civic Design Lab. It was also around social resilience, so looking at housing and economic security. So we worked a lot on those issues and creating services. The first digital service the city's had on its rent control program. And then the third was around resilient infrastructure and how do we adapt for climate change and these other challenges. The running thread through all of that was how do we finance this work? Where you could have the technology, you could have the right governance, but then that finance piece, that third piece, really seemed to be the conversation where the conversation stopped. So, believing in the power of Neighborly and what we're doing here to connect public agencies more directly with investors who want to create and invest in world positive projects is what we're doing today. So my work is a compilation of the past 10 years coming together and being able to help cities think about the projects they're interested in, whether it be broadband, community solar, microgrids, and other kind of sustainability and resilience projects with the capital to help take those projects off the ground. And one of the great things I love about the STIR program, I've been an ambassador, I think this is my second or third time, is working with startups who really want to solve those hard problems. Because I think having a boots on the ground perspective from local government has definitely served me well in my work here at Neighborly. And I do think it's important to build that empathy with the folks who are going to be using your products, whether they be inside a government or outside.
Awesome. I love that. Thanks, Kiran. Yeah, we've heard a lot from the startup teams about kind of where they have, we're midway through the program, the 16-week program, and there have been some that have had to kind of shift their initial expectations around the amount of time that their sponsor city department kind of point of contact will actually have to spend with the teams. Can you speak a little bit to how you may have navigated that when you were working with teams in Oakland, or maybe some tips for the startups who are working with their government counterparts to kind of navigate that time and resource issue?
Absolutely. So I use one of my sayings inside City Hall was that, time is a resource constraint, particularly for public servants. And knowing that their plate is already overfull, trying to do a lot with less and, with limited resources, how can you start a conversation showing that you're helping them solve a problem that's a pain point for them, even if it might be something in the short term that doesn't serve your longer term goal, or maybe it's in the service of your longer term goal. How can you be a resource for them so they're not feeling like you're adding to that plate, right? So they're already overburdened plate. And I know a lot of times it's hard because the information you're trying to get, whether it's data or, I just need these 5 folks to get down my process map to understand, what this journey looks like. it's time out of their really busy days. And so I think having that empathy is so important, and just acknowledging it up front, I also think helps go a long way.
Definitely. Great. That's helpful. Thank you, Kiran. I'm going to hand it over to Rupal, who has a question for you. Rupal, do you want to go ahead and ask Kiran? Hi.
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me? So Kiran, something that you talked about is the problem with funding for these bigger projects. Why, like a lot of these bigger projects and these tough challenges are common across lots of cities nationally and internationally. So there seems to be a market for fixing these problems. Why is it so hard to get funding? Is it because of the inherent kind of long-term scope of these projects and getting kind of cities to pay for something that has such a long-term horizon is difficult, or like why is funding so difficult?
Well, break it down for me. Funding, I mean, can you give me a specific project? Because there's definitely different pools of funding. And when we talk about public finance, that's, helping with capital improvement projects versus, say, government procurement of a technology contract, which has, its own set of rules and whatnot that an agency will go through.
Yeah, so what you're talking about were some of those like longer term things about building resiliency for a city. So whether that's climate change or broadband is another one,
right.
A couple of those meaty sort of projects.
Yeah, so I think, and that's a great question, I think a lot of it comes down to what are we building? Like what's the scope of the project before we actually even go out to RFP? And I know for at least for broadband, as well as for these larger resiliency projects, there could be feasibility studies, technical studies, what is it that's possible? Who's doing what? What does the capital stack look like to get one of these projects off the ground? Are we looking at private capital, public capital, a mix of both? We at Neighborly believe that public capital, because it's a low cost capital, is the way we should be financing our public infrastructure. But there has been a great deal of conversation around what role does private capital play in this? And so that can take a lot of time, negotiation. There's a lot of different parties involved. And if you think about, like, use broadband as an example, so think of the public right-of-way and how many people touch the public right-of-way. It's your Department of Transportation, it's your Department of Information Technology, it could be your police department, from a public safety standpoint. There's just different actors within the ecosystem of a government that have to be coordinated. And then you have to coordinate on top of that with the third party players. And so I think what I have seen, which is more effective, is designing the conversation before you get all those folks in the room and designing for the outcome that you're looking for, right? If at the end of this, it's an agreement as to what the scope of work should be like for an RFP, then that's how the conversation should be designed. If it's how do we get the city manager on board with the IT director, knowing that we have the capital stack and all that other stuff figured out, then design for that conversation. I think there's a lot of time spent in meetings where we don't have the most efficient conversations. And I do think that having the intent of what you're trying to get out of an interaction with the city official is very, very helpful.
Awesome. Thanks, Kiran. Can you talk a little bit about, you bring up RFPs and the competitive bid process and procurement, which, as myself as a vendor, I definitely spend a lot of time in that space. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about Neighborly's approach using municipal bonds and how and kind of compare that to what some of us who contract with government experience through the competitive bid process.
Sure. So public finance has two components. It can be negotiated, like a traditional procurement process, or competitive, where you're bidding on, the financing of a project. And I think, same legislation, there's procurement considerations, and every city has its own set of procurement rules. So, as a former city attorney, it wasn't so much the contract that actually I felt like was onerous. It was all the schedules that support the contract. Do you do business in Arizona? Does your company transport nuclear waste? There's all of these rules that are established at the local level that companies find themselves having to adhere to. And I think, on the public finance side, it's more streamlined because, your finance director will put out something, maybe 5 underwriters will respond, and through, their scoring metric and all that good stuff, they'll pick one, but they'll still have to get it approved by the city council or the governing authority, and take all the legal steps necessary to effectuate that transaction. So I think that's very similar on the for other procurement methods. It's just there isn't when you're comparing it to the type of project, like trying to take a project from 0 to 1, like a broadband master plan, is very different than in the municipal bond space, where you already know what you're financing with that contract, right? That's already been decided, either through your capital improvement plan or some other decision that other folks have made. Very rarely is it a 0 to 1.
Great. I could go on and on with questions about muni bonds, but I'll spare the rest of the taking me back to my public finance class. And I think we've talked a little bit about impact investing and measuring the impact of muni bonds. And anyway, that's like a whole other office hours conversation. But I want to turn it over to Daniel, who put a question in the chat. Daniel, you want to ask Kiran your question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think sort of going back to maybe your chief resilience officer hat, I think one of the really exciting things that we see a lot of STIR teams and other civic tech startups doing are being really forward thinking in a way that comes up with sort of new ways to tackle government problems that government may not ourselves be thinking, like, oh, we need to go look for this sort of solution.
Right.
So I guess I was wondering, both from your perspective, like from within the cities and then now with Neighborly, if you have thoughts on effective ways to start conversations or sort of to engage cities on solutions that they don't feel like they desperately need, but that once you have the conversation, they might appreciate the value of, whatever it is they're doing for the work they do.
Sure. I think one of the benefits of being a CRO was I sat at a high level of government and was able to see like these different agencies, how they work together and how they might not work together, right? So I think there's a lot of siloed conversations that happen which impact the overall work that cities do, and they may not realize like how much time they are spending on something that might be in the purview of another agency as well. And this came around our economic security work. There was like 3 different agencies that were owning that piece of the work, but for different reasons. And once we started breaking down those conversations, which I think Judy was part of some of those early conversations, we got to see there were some overlaps, and just showing them like, hey, if we were able to connect these dots for you in a more seamless way, it would make your workload not only more efficient, but it would give you time to do the other things that you haven't been able to get to on your list. And so again, putting it in really kind of real terms for how you are trying to benefit them, even if it's not a high priority item for them, but putting it in terms of, I know you have limited resources, here's how I can help you. Here's a time saver that, oh, by the way, will also deliver more impactful service, I think really resonates with city agency officials. And to be fair, like as a CRO, it wasn't like I had this huge mandate like from everybody saying, hey, you've got to do this. You really had to kind of build from within and from bottom up and create those relationships where people wanted to work with our office because they saw the value that we were providing them in their day-to-day.
Awesome, thanks.
Along those lines, Kiran, so what I've heard you say is developing empathy, demonstrating to the city contact that whatever the product will be at the end is worth the upfront time investment. Can you think of a time when you were in the city of Oakland, for example, where there was just a really stellar vendor who sold you on something? And what were, if so, are there any other tips that you can give for some of the STIR startups on how they might interface effectively?
Well, define stellar vendors. So the product was really stellar, or the vendor themselves were just like an awesome person?
That is a great clarification. So, and I'm thinking about anecdotes that I heard from Mai Ling about her sort of getting cornered in the elevator by vendors while, when she's working at the city. What is a good approach? Is it a cold email? Is it a cold call? Is it coming up to you in person? So I guess maybe it's more about
How they approach.
Exactly.
Okay. Right. So, because I had two ways to answer that question. So one, in terms of the approach, I do think, cornering somebody in an elevator is not the right approach. But again, saying, hey, I saw that I had vendors who called me like, hey, I just read your Resilient Oakland playbook. Here's where I think we could help. And had a really concrete kind of initial proposal that if I felt like they had put time and thought into it, worth a conversation, right? To understand what their scope was, what their business model is, how we could potentially work together. The second, obviously would be, somebody like the mayor saying, hey, I just met this really great company, you should have a conversation with them. She typically were in these forums that we might not always be in. And so having that connect, and I'm thinking about a conversation we had with Literati, where I had met the founder there, and it led to a conversation where they could help us with Save the Bay Day, right? It was a cleanup day where we thought it'd be great to gamify the process with children using this app. So, that's another way that I think we found engagement. The other one is really around what is it that you want, and how are you communicating that out so you get the right folks to come in and respond? And so thinking about the digital service we did around the rent control program, we worked with a design firm to actually bring in the end users, so the landlords, the tenants, city staff, and to create what are the needs that you have around this, and put that into our RFP and then send that out to folks. And I think we got a higher hit rate from folks that we felt like we could really work with. So we ended up ultimately selecting Tomorrow Partners, which I know has done work with San Francisco. And their ability to work within a silo, these different silos within an organization, but make the connections that they needed to make to get the information they needed to design our product was really key. They also just were a delight to work with. And they understood right away, for me, it's not about an MVP because there's no such thing in government. And they're like, right, for us, an MVP means maximum value product. And I love that framing because it's true. We don't always have time for the MVPs. They very quickly turn into what you end up using by default. So we really have to kind of scope that from the outset very, very carefully, which makes it hard, right? Because when you're in an environment where it's agile and iterative and you want to build something, you also, I think, to the decision makers, you have to show that there's a product here that solves the problem you wanted to solve. And that's another thing I think vendors need to understand.
Yeah, that's great. So it's looking like we had one startup join today. There's a little mix up again with the calendar invite, so we don't want to take up too much more of your time. But I want to do kind of a last run through with folks on the phone, particularly Sarah, if you want to introduce yourself to Kiran and talk a little bit about the project that you're working on, and if you have any questions for her before we wrap up.
Sure. Hi, Kiran. My name is Sarah, and I'm a co-founder along with Ryan Lugenbuhl and Philippe Derajou in Help Emerge. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, great. I had a question. I actually had two questions. The first one is around what you were mentioning with siloed departments within a city. And if we're working with several departments within a city, what is the best mechanism to go about kind of getting everybody on board with joining us? Just in general.
Right. So you need buy-in from the top, as well as the folks who are on frontline staff, who are going to be the ones who are engaging in your work and giving you the information that you need. So, the way we would handle it is actually through workshops and have these intentionally designed conversations to bring all the folks together. feeling included in the conversation is really important. So even if folks are too busy and can't make it, I think it's really important to have that gesture that their voice matters in the process. And once you bring them together, and this is what we did with the Resilient Oakland Playbook, we had several workshops where we brought together about 30, 40 city staff from all over the organization to pinpoint these are the issues that the community has raised in terms of what they would like to have solved. How can you help in that process of being able to reach a resolution? And you would find when you ask people how can they help solve the problem, it's a very different response than just telling them this is what you're going to do. And we built a lot of empathy, which is a word that I love, but also a lot of trust in the process, which is so important, because when things might not be going 100% right, or you might have to switch tracks and say, hey, I know we were focusing on A, now we need to move to B. If you've already built that internal buy-in, it just helps your project also go more smoothly.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. That's really helpful. And the other question I had was more about the legal hurdles and what we should sort of be watching out for, either in the contract phase or maybe later on as we continue the engagement with city departments.
So, Judy, remind me, are most of these, I know there's cities from around the country that could potentially engage these companies, right? So it's not just California.
That's right. Daniel, do you want to speak to how many states we have involved at this point?
Yeah, so we're mostly still pretty California heavy. And Sarah and Ryan are working with West Sacramento.
Great.
Outside of California, we also work with Houston, Washington, D.C., and Miami-Dade County.
Okay, fabulous. So this will be a California-centric answer. I mean, every state has their own procurement laws, but one of the things that I see potentially tripping up vendors is something called 1090, which is no conflict of interest in the making of a contract. And I think sometimes when folks are trying to get that buy-in from public agencies to want the product that they're building or help them solve the problem that they've identified, they tend, there's this line between becoming a consultant versus being a vendor for that service. And so when you get into the consultant line, and if you're seen as helping make that RFP that you then want to bid on, that becomes a conflict of interest that will immediately disqualify you. So it's just something to keep in mind. And Jay, Nath, and I have had several conversations about this, and that's why the STIR program is designed the way it is, to obviate that concern. I would think on other things to think about legally, cities are subject to the Public Records Act in California, and many states have their sunshine laws. So even when you're trying to be open and sharing a lot of great information, just be mindful of what's proprietary versus what you'd be fine having in the domain, open domain. And as they say, every email you send, to a city official, imagine it being read out, right, publicly. So I guess those are just some of the legal things. I mean, every contract is different. I know that limitation of liability and indemnity clauses are some things that vendors continuously struggle with cities, especially because cities are self-insured. There's more care provided on the city side to make sure that their interests are protected. So that's just something to be aware of as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really helpful for me as well. Thanks, Karen. I've been taking some notes. Okay, so we are coming up a little after 12:30. Does anyone else on the STIR team have any final thoughts or updates you'd like to share with Kiran? Or Kiran, are there any questions or comments you have for us before we give you some of your time back today?
Well, I appreciate it. I just love to hear what you said. There's one company that joined us. What folks are working on?
Right, Sarah, did you want to go ahead and take that?
Sure, happy to. We are working on a civic engagement tool with West Sacramento, specifically for their use case, creating a platform to match volunteers with specific events of interest.
Excellent. I know that there's a lot. I can already think of the departments that would need to use that.
yeah, we're happy to hear other use cases as well, but we're finding that because each department within West Sacramento does have volunteers and they're not necessarily always seeing the overlap between departments and between even events that they're hosting, this will be a really great versatile tool for them, and also to encourage collaboration between departments.
Fabulous. We did try getting folks on Slack inside City Hall.
How did that go?
And how did that go? No, not great.
Okay, we'll get there eventually.
Well, Karen, we had our mid-program share-out call last week, and I had the opportunity to hear from quite a few of the city folks and the startups. So I'm just going to hand it over to Daniel to share really briefly some of his favorite projects that are happening from the Moki side.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. So apologies for being a little San Francisco specific here. I know we're not supposed to have favorite children, but things in my backyard are always pretty exciting for me. So a few of the other projects we have. So one is a company that really helps cities understand, in a sense, like social media sentiment and engage with the residents that way. And the actual application of that for STIR right now is that they're working with San Francisco's 311 to help essentially clean and then route requests coming from residents to the right departments. So knowing that a graffiti request might go to Rexon Park if it's on a statue in a park, and it might go to Public Works if it's on like a fire hydrant, but helping cut down the amount of time that it takes to get requests to the right department so that the city can actually be solving those quickly. And they're just starting to build in image recognition as well. So actually using machine learning to say, you know, this picture is of something that should go to this department. So that's one that I'm especially excited for, just because I know as a city, 311 is the primary way that residents connect with us. So the quicker that we're able to be responsive to that and help solve problems, I think the better we will do. Another one that I'm really, really excited about is we have a team based out of Stanford that does computational law, and they're helping make the planning code more accessible. So if someone wants to, I know it's quite a Herculean task, it seems. But if someone wants to, say, put in a cafe in a certain neighborhood, right now they would need to go like parcel by parcel and then review the code for that parcel and say, okay, what's and this startup's actually putting it in. So based on just answering some general questions within a specific area, they can say, okay, here are parcels that might work for you. And on the flip side, they can more quickly evaluate different uses at an individual parcel. So saying, if I'm on the third story of this building in this neighborhood, could I create, you know, this sort of business?
Great.
So yeah, that's a really exciting one. And then just one other one that I'll hit on is also on the sort of public safety side of things. There's a team in Houston that's startups based out of Chicago, and they're working with the city of Houston to alert drivers for flooding overpasses. So thinking about with climate change and, you know, having more catastrophic weather events going forward, the ability for the city to actually engage directly with drivers through the apps that they're using to say this is an unsafe area to avoid during flooding could be really, really beneficial.
Absolutely. And you saw that with the North County fires and the mudslides in Montecito.
Yeah.
People just didn't have access to the right information, knowing when to leave and what was happening. So very, very critical.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those, Daniel. I really loved the Houston team. They had like 4 people on the call last week, which was really cool because they're just really excited about it. You know, now that STIR is kind of expanding, we're not so much in our bubbles, which is really great. The other thing that I wanted to add to what Daniel said is the Stanford group. What's really cool about them is they created this startup because of STIR. Hi, Jay.
Hey, Jay.
Hey everybody, hi.
So I love, just kind of the range of startups that have been around for 7-ish years, but are just getting their first public sector customer through STIR, to those who are creating a startup because of the program. So, yeah. And with that, anything else anyone wants to add or ask of Kiran before we give her some of her time back today?
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate your support for the program as always, and it's good to see you.
Too. Tell everybody I said hello.
Will do.
All
right.
Thank you, Kiran.
Thanks, Kiran.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Okay,
Bye.
bye.